Hello and good evening and welcome to UCL this evening. It's interesting because on these occasions I usually get to ask who's been to UCL before, but I'm pretty well assuming that it's everybody at this point unless you've snuck in just for the free wine, in which case I applaud your dedication for hanging around for this bit afterwards. My name's Tim Barnes. I am the Director of UCL Advances, which is UCL's Centre for Entrepreneurship. And I'm going to be chairing the panel discussion this evening, and I will be introducing the panelists, or rather asking them to introduce themselves in a moment or two. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about what is happening and what's going to happen this evening in the format that things will take. Explain a little bit about what we do in this area now and a couple of other things like that before we get into the heart of the discussion. So the format of things this evening is going to be a panel discussion. I'm going to ask each of our four eminent alums who've each gone on to start a business after their time here to say a little bit about their time at UCL and what it is that they've done in their entrepreneurial lives, and ask a few sort of questions to get a discussion going, and then pretty well, as quickly as we can, turn it over to you guys to start asking them some questions and popping some of the sort of suggestions out of them of things that you might be interested in and you might want to learn from, and hopefully get something that's interesting going. Because the objective for us at the end of this, I hope, is that we've got a community of people here who are interested in entrepreneurship, who are interested in keeping in touch and in working with UCL, who see the value in doing that and in talking to each other. This is not, I repeat, not about us asking you for money. I like the nervousness of the laughter in that, because it sort of started at the front and moved backwards. The closer you were to me and thinking I might be about to ask you for a check, the more appreciative you were of the laughter. But anyway, there you go. This is about us trying to establish a community of people who actually are interested in this topic. Now, we've had a community of entrepreneurs, of seasoned entrepreneurs who've come out of UCL, who've met for some time. But it's indeed a very different kind of gathering to this. And in fact, a lot of things have changed around UCL. Can I just ask, out of curiosity, who here graduated before academic year 2007-8? Okay, which is pretty good. That's pretty well the vast majority. So I'm assuming that those of you who just put your hands up have no idea what UCL Advances is or who the hell I am. Brilliant. Because if at this point you'd all gone, yeah, we know, I would have been stuck for what I was going to say for the next 5 minutes. I'd probably have had to tell you some jokes, something like that. Wouldn't have been funny. It would have been a disaster. So what I do want to do is just basically briefly outline what that is and explain a little bit of how things have changed. Because since the majority of you were here as students, UCL, in its engagement with entrepreneurs and in what we provide, has changed a lot. UCL Advances was set up about 3.5 years ago as our Centre for Entrepreneurship, and it is not an academic department. We don't teach entrepreneurship, we don't engage in academic research. We exist to support students that want to set up companies, and at the moment we support about 35 or 40 of those to do it a year. We're aiming to hit about 100 a year in the next couple of years. We support and help develop the culture of entrepreneurship amongst staff and students, and we go out and we actively help support small businesses and entrepreneurs across London, nationally, but obviously for geographic reasons, London makes a focus for that, in all sorts of ways, and we support a couple of hundred a year like that. We help supply all sorts of things to do with expertise and financing and networking and business plan development and all the things that UCL knows something about, and help to make that much more easily accessible by entrepreneurs and small businesses than it ever has been before. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that at the end and direct you to some of the people that you might be interested in if that's relevant to your business. But I'm mentioning it now because what I'm underlining is this is about me, this bit anyway, telling you what we can do for you. Okay? So this is not necessarily all about one-way traffic. We've got plenty of ways in which we like to see entrepreneurs from the UCL ranks come back and help with things. We are in desperate need at times of people who want to be mentors to students or academics who think that they know how to start a business. We have on the right-hand side, as I'm looking at it, left-hand side as you're there, Dr. Dave Chapman, who's by the wall there, who is the Deputy Head of our Department of Management Science, and today was inducting 12 mentors in the challenge of mentoring 63 of his Masters in Technology Entrepreneurship students through their summer programs. People who are able and willing to do things like that are extremely welcome, and we would like to engage you in that, partly for our own benefit and the students' benefit, and partly because we think it's something that you'll enjoy as well. I've never met an entrepreneur that didn't want to evangelize being an entrepreneur. It kind of seems to go with the territory. And I should stress at this point that that's partly because that's who I am. I am not an academic. I have no academic qualifications at all that make any difference to me being able to know anything about entrepreneurship. I started here as a student, an undergrad in medieval history, which, is anybody here an historian? Sorry, what period? So it's just a question historians ask each other. It's kind of like, it's just the way that geographers ask each other, oh, really? Human or physical? Anyway, colouring pencils or satellites, which the other one. Sorry, what period? Early modern history. Early modern, yes, not really history. Who's the other one? History of medicine, that doesn't count at all. Did anybody here do a proper historical subject? Right, so I read medieval history, which concentrated mainly on the development of the Catholic Church, which between the period of about 400 and 1200 developed nearly all of the facets of the modern multinational corporation. Template documents, franchising, the mass deployment of double-entry bookkeeping, international money transfers, all there about 1,000 years before Microsoft decided that they were something that they could put a Bill widget icon and try and trademark on and charge you extra money for. This has served me extremely well as one of the great pieces of business planning that I've worked with through my life. I've also worked as a venture capitalist and as somebody who's been involved with starting about 22, 25, somewhere around there, companies of different types. And what that underlines is not how brilliant I am, although clearly it does. It's really about the fact of how we've approached this. This is our approach to entrepreneurship, and the reason why this is of interest to us is because we are not about trying to just teach a dry academic subject. This is going to be the first university in the UK that is going to offer the experience of working in an entrepreneurial or small business environment to every single student. We're going to try and also be, a couple of years from now, the first to try and offer it to every single student in every single year of their studies. We are the first university that has set a target for which we will actively support students that want to start businesses. And we have plenty of those who are doing it now, probably more than anywhere else. And this is the wonderful thing. We don't have a business school, so we don't have people who are wandering around with MBAs who are screwing up the process of actually starting companies by telling us how we should do it. We just get on and do it. And an example of that is Chester. So Chester, you want to stand up for a sec? Chester is a final year philosophy undergraduate student. Any other philosophers here? Oh, brilliant. Right, there you go. Chester's usually used to being one of the few in this case. He won't, I'll spare his blushes, but he's basically a final year student on your third startup as an undergrad? Yeah. Arguably fourth. Still working on two of them. Yeah, still working on two of them. On everything from being the first man in the world to launch a potato into space, which was actually a money-making venture. You can argue about that. If you saw potatoes being launched into space in the press last year, that was him. But do you want to just very briefly in 2 minutes pitch your current company? So, enough of the setup and my opening pitch. I'll come back and try and wham that in with a hammer at the end by repeating much of it. But we'll now turn to the main event this evening and our panel discussion. I'm not going to say too much about each of the panelists this evening. I'm going to let them introduce themselves in terms of their time at UCL and their experiences as an entrepreneur, and then seed the conversation with a couple of questions before, as I say, we'll turn it over to you. So if you can be thinking of questions now, that'll help when we get there. And so I'm very quickly going to basically go down the line, and Andrew, if you don't mind, if I start with you, say a little bit about your time at UCL as an entrepreneur, and just as a practicality for the speakers, if you could lean into the microphone slightly to pick it up. This is not because you actually need a microphone in a lecture theatre that's built for acoustics, but because we're picking it up for the recording at the back. So thank you very much. If you wouldn't mind everybody putting your hands together and welcoming the panel. Thank you. And with that set up, Andrew, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off. Thank you.
Yes, very nice to get a round of applause before we open our mouths. Good evening. Very nice to see you all. Thank you for coming and listening to us. I hope it's fruitful. I was at UCL I graduated in '91 from economics, which I believe was a much smaller department than it is today. And I would say that it started in my first year, this idea of going into the restaurant business, because I studied economics at high school, and economics is a sort of general subject that draws in everybody with no economics background. So I found, having done A-level economics, a great deal of the first year work had already been done, so I had a fair amount of time on my hands. And I said earlier to the panel here, I think I spent the first year doing 4 hours a week. That's all I was actually scheduled for. Those were the days 20 years ago. So I didn't have an awful lot to do, and a friend of mine was over from America. who had a culture of working in a restaurant, and I thought, why not earn a bit of cash? So I ended up working in a restaurant with her, which happened to be in Leicester Square. The restaurant's still there. It's called Chiquitos now. It was called Chi-Chi's back then, but I was a door host, and that was my introduction to the restaurant business. And it was an awful lot of fun. And that's perhaps the first thing that I noticed, that this was a lot of fun. I was making good money. It was in the good old days 20 years ago when the government provided education for free and provided maintenance grants. Some of you in the audience might remember that. But there were no costs to being a student, and I was earning money. I think I was working 3 or 4 nights a week down there, and I was basically loaded.
In a purely cash sense,
in real
obviously.
terms, don't think I've ever been wealthier than I was when I was a student at UCL. And I think those times have long gone. But it was a fantastic introduction to the restaurant business. So when I graduated, which I just about did, I thought, this is the business for me. I'm going to go and work at the Savoy, which was a very credible thing to do. It was also a fantastic discipline, and I would recommend any graduate now who is thinking of going into any business, but I can obviously speak about my business a bit better, you need to go and get some great experience. So that's what I did, and I arrived there far too big for my boots. I talked my way onto what they called was the management training program, which was a 5-year program involving basically a year or 2 being a waiter, and then 6 months being a wine waiter, and then a year working in the hotel bedrooms, and then a year on the desk, and 6 months abroad, and all very tedious. And I spent about 6-7 months as a waiter and 3 months as a chef. Thought I knew it all, and announced to them that I was off to open my own restaurant, which was very big-headed, and had I done it, would have probably been a very sad state of affairs. So luckily, I ran into my current business partner now, and I went to work for him, and I got further great experience. That was a business called Café Flow. For those of you who remember, there were only 5 or 6 of them around London at the time. I then worked subsequently for a fellow called Anthony Royal Thompson, who is one of these television chefs, still going strong, a fantastic fellow, not the greatest businessman of all time, but highly creative and a very charming fellow. And learned a great deal with him. So that got me into a different end of the restaurants, and I ended up running a restaurant actually that took, in 1993, something like this, it was taking about £50,000–60,000 a week. And it was a vast restaurant. In real terms, that's it was one of the busiest restaurants in London, and it was quite a scene. And again, I thought to myself, this is a wonderful business to be in. And I then went abroad. I went and lived in Israel for 5 or 6 years. And not really knowing what to do in Israel, I would say that I fell into the entrepreneurial life. And my view, I'm not quite sure if anybody was to ask me to define that word, I'm not sure I would know. So I think you're going to have difficulty teaching it. But it's one of those things that people fall into. You've got a hobby, you've got an interest, you want to turn it into a business, you might not want to work for somebody else. All of these are very good reasons. I think to wake up one day and say, I'm going to be an entrepreneur, but have no idea what you're going to do, is perhaps the wrong way of going about it. And so circumstances dictated, an opportunity came along, and we opened a restaurant in Israel and a catering company that was fantastic. It was my first business. It was critically wonderful, financially poor. But we did learn an awful lot. And then we looked at doing the current business now, Giraffe, in Israel. We decided that the market just isn't big enough for any of you know that country. It's smaller than Wales. So to open a chain restaurant, you run out of geography very quickly. So we decided to come back here. We were both British, my partner and I, and we started in '98 with one little startup in Hampstead, which is where I lived. And it was an enormous success, so we invested heavily in a second site, which was an absolute disaster. And we found for about 18 months, the second site was losing far more money than the first site was making. A good lesson in itself. So the third site was make or break. Unfortunately, it worked very well, and then we carried on from there. So it was a very slow progression. We're now a business of 40 42.5 restaurants. We've got the 43rd one opening up in Bath. Any of you from Bath? Shame, because it's a fantastic site. It's going to be a week, not next week, the week after, is opening in Bath. So it's what we're calling the next generation. So we're trying to grow up the whole business by through design and service and new ideas that we're introducing there. And there have been a number of steps along the way, which I'm sure if any of you are interested, I'm happy to talk about along the way. But it's been a fantastic journey. We've taken investment a couple of times from quite key people, one of them being Luke Johnson, who's a bit of a mover and shaker in our industry, and another one being 3i, which is a large private equity house. And so we have our masters as well. It's very much not a small family business as we like to think it is. It's a business that has to be run professionally, and that is good and bad. We get the scale, we get the excitement, we get a little bit of the prestige, but we also have to work very hard. And I think it's certainly in the current environment, our business is challenging. I can talk about it this evening, but it's not something I would change. I think being self-employed, being to some extent in control of one's own destiny is absolutely fantastic. I'd recommend it highly, and I think that's about it.
Brilliant. Andrew, thank you very much for that introduction.
Another round of applause.
As you said, it's one thing to get a round of applause at the beginning, it's another to get a round of applause at the end. So let's see if we can keep this going as well. So our second panellist this evening is Lily, founder of Lily Vanilli Cakes. Would you perhaps like to give your account of your time so far?
Sure. So I was a philosophy student at UCL. I didn't really envision having any practical applications for that degree, but if I could go back, I would do it again. I mean, I chose it out of a love for the subject and a realization that I would probably never have, or not for a long time have, 3 years where I could just read philosophy and spend my time doing that. But I had a lot of other hobbies which were much more vocational, and I kind of, after I graduated, I pursued lots of them. I did different things, but I think my real love was to travel and to try new things. So I started a lot of careers that I didn't get very far with out of choice. The last one being working as a graphic designer in Australia for the Australian Greens Party, and I did all the graphic design advertising for the 2007 election campaign there. Was there for 2 years and then came back to London. And I'd saved, I was telling the story earlier, but I'd saved a bit of money. I spent the summer here kind of spending the money. And, and then realised after a little while that I wasn't getting any jobs. Like the recession really kicked in, was becoming everyday life. And anyway, it was taking me longer than usual to get a job. So I'd always had a passion for baking. I had like a childish ambition to be a baker, but never really envisioned it being a possibility. But I was really broke, so I started selling cakes at the weekend, even just to make an extra 20, 30 quid. I set up a little market with friends off Brick Lane in a building that wasn't being used. We had bands and margaritas, and it was really just for fun. No one ever really came. But one of the people that did come was a journalist for the Times who wrote about food, and she wrote a really positive review. And
of the whole place, or just of one of your cakes?
Of the cakes. It was all about food, so it was about cakes, and it was about the emerging trend for cupcakes in London. And I was really pushed to the forefront of that by the press. And I mean, my cupcakes are good, but I never had an ambition to start a cupcake business. I'm a baker, and I kind of found the whole thing around cupcakes quite depressing and grotesque. It was really very style over substance, very fashionable, and it was really like a lot of poor baking. It was very expensive, and they look pretty, but they weren't good. So I spent the last 2 years since my business started in February 2009, so it's 2 years old, and I spent most of the time trying to get away from that label, even though it was the lifeblood of my business. But I was aware that it was a trend and it wasn't what I wanted to do. So I started supplying Harrods about 6 months ago, and I went in with cupcakes, which is what they wanted from me. And we're relaunching in about a month's time with no cupcakes. So layer cakes, quite conceptual little cake sculptures, brownies, cookies, flapjacks, very quintessentially British baking products. And I think the business has evolved in lots of different ways, but thankfully away from that label, which, you know, is what it is. So hopefully I can answer some useful questions for you this evening. I mean, my experience of being an entrepreneur is just utilising a skill to make money in a very simple way. I didn't have a business plan. I didn't have any investment. I didn't have any money. But I think if you have, I think the core strength of my business is good product and a really hard-working ethic, and the ability to utilise opportunities when I see them. So hopefully I have some advice for you.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Now, our next panellist going down the line is going to move away from the sort of the food business end of the table into the understanding whether or not it is that you like this. Has anybody here ever been spammed by YouGov and asked to join a poll? Anybody? You can volunteer. I have. See, we're underrepresented in the YouGov stakes, Nadine. We need to do something about that. There's clearly not enough voice for this. But Nadine, perhaps you'd like to tell a bit about your story and how you got from UCL to where you are now.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you for having me on the panel. You're going to have to cast your mind back some 25 years ago, a quarter of a century. I am the oldest on the panel, I think, by a long way. I was at UCL. In fact, in this building, before it looked like this, it was a pretty dreary building in those days, and I read chemical engineering. I wasn't very good at it, nor did I enjoy it that much, to be honest with you. But, I think I lied to Malcolm Grant when I said I really enjoyed chemical engineering. But what it did teach me, actually, on a more serious point, is to handle a lot of data, which I think that's probably what we've all got in common if you've read anything like engineering, and be able to work out what's material from that data to get you through university, to essentially get you through the exams. What UCL also gave me is a taste of politics. I, on my first week here, was going through ULU and was accosted by the Socialist Worker Party activists who wanted to give me one of their magazines. I said, no, thank you, because I had no interest in politics in those days, absolutely none whatsoever. I'm much more interested in going out and partying and everything else. And he decided that that was the day he was going to beat up a new student. And so I was the victim. It didn't quite get that far, but it was pretty terrifying. And so I thought, well, you know what, if that's how they behave, I'm going to go and see what the other side think, which is where I joined the Conservative Collegiate Forum. Anyway, the other thing I did do while I was here is actually be an entrepreneur by launching a business with a mate of mine when I didn't feel like attending lectures. And we managed to blag our way to getting a mortgage from a bank. And there were the days in the 80s before the crash. We managed to buy one property, flip it, and make a little bit of money. And I think that's probably what I share with the first two speakers. I had a bit of money, which I then decided to burn and waste whilst I was here still at university. When I left university, I actually fell on my feet because I met two great friends of mine who were two great entrepreneurs, Jonathan Seif and Peter Dubins, who've just launched a business called Global, which was had a contract to print the T-shirts for Robert Earl and Hard Rock Cafe. Small business in southwest London, and they said, Nadim, you're a brilliant marketeer. I knew nothing about marketing. I don't know why they thought I was a brilliant marketeer, but they said, you'd be brilliant in the company. Come and help us expand the business. And so I did. Didn't have to write a CV, just decided to pitch up and join the business. Some of you in the room may remember the changing colour T-shirts, the ones that changed with body heat, Global Hypercolour. That was me. It was a huge success for the guys who founded the business. I played a minor role as marketing director, but we ended up going from a tiny business to selling 3.5 million T-shirts in 18 months into every retailer you can think of, from sort of, Topshop to Asda. We had airport shops. It became a real phenomenon. And the boys very cleverly, and actually this is another thing about entrepreneurship, where timing is everything, they sold the business just in time to Coates Viella PLC and made their first fortune. They've gone on to do things like UK Betting and Pipex and lots of other great businesses themselves. But that's how I got introduced into the world of marketing. At the same time, I kept up my sort of political passion, and I became a councillor in Wandsworth, where I lived, in Putney. And I served for 12 years in local government, always thinking one day I would actually want to go into politics. I then, through sort of friends of friends who knew the then candidate for London Mayor, if you remember, when the mayoralty was introduced, the Conservative candidate for about 5 minutes was one Jeffrey Archer. I happened to join that campaign as a volunteer. The chief of staff for that campaign was a chap called Stephen Shakespeare, who was a brilliant mind and a real inspiration for me, and was a fantastic partner in what I then founded, which was YouGov. Our candidate blew himself up, very famously, very publicly. If you remember, ended up serving time in prison. And Stefan was out of work. I still had my day job as European marketing director. I had reached then for another organisation. But I loved working with Stefan so much that I wanted to sort of do a business together. And this was sort of 1999, 2000, when the internet was just becoming, or the sort of bubble was just beginning to reach its sort of extremes. Anyway, we came up with the idea of YouGov, and it was a simple idea, and it actually came out of a passion, and we naively didn't really think about a business plan or how we're going to make money out of it. We just thought, actually, because we were passionate about politics and campaigning, the research we were using, the traditional companies that we were using, the Morries and NOPs of this world, were very expensive, but also incredibly slow. So you'd pay them a load of money, they give you the research, a great big tome of paper. Half the time it's useless, and the other half you're saying, well, actually, if I could just delve a bit further into that, or go to that particular group of people, wouldn't that be brilliant? And our proposition was that the internet must be a better way of collecting information. There's one thing you can't knock the internet for, is the ability to collect vast amounts of information, as long as you can structure that information into something that is usable. And that is essentially the concept of YouGov. With that, we had the sort of the romantic idea of the sort of the Boston Tea Party, no taxation without representation, and the world was going to change because of technology, and the equation, the equilibrium between the executive, that is government, big corporations, and us, the citizenry, is going to move in favour of the citizen. Remember, these were the early days. This is 1999, 2000. We launched the business. We got lucky because there was a portal called FreeServe, some of you may remember, where we went to see the founders of it, Stanley Carnes from Dixon's, and said, "We've got an idea, Stanley." And he said, "Look, you both got no money. Tell me what your idea is. You've got about 5 minutes in my office to tell me what the idea is." So we pitched this idea. 45 minutes later, we thought we must be doing something right. We're still in the office. And he asked the founder, Ajaz Ahmed, who was the real founder of FreeServe, to come up from the basement of their building in Mayfair. And we were there for about 3.5 hours. We walked out, and within a week, we were the opinion channel on FreeServe. So when you gave your opinion at FreeServe, it went to a YouGov server. And that was how we built the initial panel. That was all great, but we were still not making any money. And we were just hemorrhaging cash, had a small team of young developers and young people who were working for us. Yet, we had no idea how we were going to make money out of this thing. Anyway, we had our launch party in the atrium on Westminster Embankment. And that went swimmingly. We had some good investors there who were very excited about writing checks out, but we still had to sort of work out the paperwork and all these things that you have to do when you're a struggling entrepreneur. And 2 weeks later, the dot-com bubble burst. you know, if you remember, that I think that the week of our launch was the week when lastminute.com had IPO'd and had gone to its maximum price, and then 2 weeks later it went to nothing. And we were like lepers in the sort of the world of finance. Nobody wanted to know a .com. All our investors fell away, apart from, to be fair, our angel investor, bless him, who still sent the check in, kept us alive. We had to eventually remortgage our homes to keep the business afloat, because everywhere we went, everyone we talked to said, I'm sorry, Nadeem and Stefan, look, we've lost so much money on other .coms, we can't put any money in. We had to drop .com from the way it was called YouGov.com Limited initially. In the end, one of our high net worth friends said, look, I can't help you because I won't put any money in, but you two look so passionate and you believe in, we're showing them all this data and the comparables versus the offline and how much more accurate it is, that, you know, he said, you're so passionate, what I will do is introduce you to my mortgage broker who will get you a mortgage or remortgage in a week. And it took us about 30 seconds to agree to that. And it's the best decision we ever made in our lives. The rest really became history. Our real breakthrough came through academia, which is an interesting link back to UCL, which is why I'm so excited about backing Tim and what Malcolm Grant is doing here. And that's the Economic and Social Research Council, sadly not through UCL, but another university, which administered the British Election Study, which is the, sort of the gold standard of research for elections. They came to us and said, look, you know, this whole internet thing, this online research thing is all very interesting, and you're the guys that are pioneering it. Would you parallel, same questions you have to ask, what NOP and Mori are asking, sorry, NOP and Gallup were asking, not Mori, on face-to-face and telephone? We said, of course we will. We'll do the whole thing for you, no problem. You know, how much do you think you'll be paying us? I said, oh, well, actually, there is no money. We've allocated the money to the other two organisations because no one knew anything about online research at the time. Anyway, we were like a pair of drowning rats. We took on the project. We wiped the floor with the other two offline researchers. We called the election to within 0.7%. And the raw data, more importantly, was of a higher quality because we had to all submit our raw data. No one could argue about the questions because they're identical. Was of a higher quality. Anyway, the academics started writing white papers on this, and in the last 11 years, we've done something like 16 projects where our average error is 1%. That's the real USP of what YouGov did, is the ability to show that online you can have incredibly detailed modeling and therefore get much deeper and much better accuracy when it comes to market research or political research for that matter. Took the company public in 2005, and I continued as chief executive of the company until February of 2010, when I was selected to fight the seat of Stratford-on-Avon as the Conservative candidate, where I stood down as chief executive, and then I came off the board when I was elected on May the 7th of 2010, and I'm now the Member of Parliament for Stratford-on-Avon, and I serve in Parliament on the Business, Innovation and Skills Select Committee, because the one thing you learn very quickly in Parliament is you really do need to focus on one department. A bit like business, you do need focus if you're going to be taken seriously or credibly, and so I've decided to focus on biz as that department. Happy to take questions.
Wonderful, thank you very much. That also means that if anybody here is from the Department of Economics and has got questions on the budget, this is the guy. But if we go far, we've had tales along the way so far that involved a second restaurant that very nearly didn't become a third and a bit of a disaster. The desire to move into cakes purely for the sake of making money, remortgaging your house, and indeed doing huge amounts of work for free. These are all the sort of low and desperate points that these guys have worked their way through. Rhys, for our final tale this evening, do you have an equal low point that you're going to come to, or was it all plain sailing from the outset?
It was all plain sailing.
All right, we can all go home then. Please.
Shall I start?
No, please, absolutely.
Yeah. After that, I feel as though I was born last week. I don't really feel like I've done anything for the last 30 years. But just to start, I did astrophysics here. It says I graduated in 2003, but I think it was 2002. I might be wrong. I basically did astrophysics because it sounded good, sounded interesting. It turned out it was one of the most painful things I've ever done. Went on to do accountancy with one of the big 4 accountancy firms. maybe because it sounded boring, and it was. I stuck with that for quite a long time, ended up in a relatively well-paid but totally unrewarding job in corporate finance, where I guess the rewards were the pay and reading about the things that you've been involved in the Financial Times, and then further on reading about all the amazing people that you've made amazingly rich, and overall relatively, well, in fact, entirely unsatisfying. At the at the same time, or as this was going on, an incident happened with my grandmother, and I'm sure a lot of you have either read a similar story or had it happen to a relative of yours or someone you know, is that my grandmother ended up having a fall, went into hospital, and typically what happens with elderly people on the NHS is they're starved, they're drugged, they're pretty much left isolated in bed, and then before you know it, they're sent off to a care home, where again they're starved and neglected and isolated, and before you know it, they've passed away, and you're left wondering what in the world happened and what were we paying £750 a week for. So I asked myself, what in the world were we paying £750 a week for? And I couldn't figure it out. I mean, that's actually quite a low level for care home costs in this country. And I realized that something was wrong, and I realized that this industry probably needs some fresh blood, needs some fresh ideas, and there's probably room to not only bring some of that in and make a difference, but to have some sort of fulfillment in a job, achieve something that seems like it's worthwhile, as well as sort of making a living out of and enjoying. So I didn't quit straight away. I ended up moving to more and more entrepreneurial companies, and discovering that entrepreneurial just means held together with a piece of string, which is really good experience to learn. And you also learn that you're at the sharp end of the stick with entrepreneurs, and they're doing everything they can to keep their business alive, and they're really going to push themselves and every one of their staff in order to make a go of it. And so it's quite inspiring, but also made me realize that if you're in a job, you're probably not getting paid what you're worth, because otherwise they wouldn't be employing you. So I did a lot of research. It turns out elderly care is, for good reason. You can't just rock up and say, right, I'll take care of your grandmother. It's highly regulated. It's you have to jump through an incredible number of hoops. But I just decided that wasn't going to dissuade me. And then first thing I did was go, okay, right, I'm going to build a better care home, and then realized care homes are sort of going in the direction of going from like being a home into being some sort of care factory where people are sort of boxed in little prefab rooms and stacked on top of each other. And to do that, to compete, you're spending tens of millions of pounds. And none of that is actually important in this industry. What's important is the quality of the people who are delivering the care. It's all about the people, how good they are, how capable they are, how much they actually care, rather than how much the building is worth. And so that combined with the fact that, most people would rather live in their homes to the ends of their lives rather than, get shoved off to a box in the country, made me realize, the way the industry is going, we want home care. It's all about the staff. It's all about people being in their own homes and comfortable. And so I threw my hands in the air and said, brilliant, I quit. This is the best thing ever. Then realized I didn't have a plan or any idea what I was going to do. So wrong order, but I quit my job. Went and did, weeks of research. It's quite, it's regulated, it's complicated, but it's not hard to get any of that information because it's all out there. There's so many resources for entrepreneurs. There's like the British Library up the road just has everything, every single industry report you could ever hope for. There's people out there in any industry you want to be in selling franchises who are happy to tell you their secret if you give them 30 grand. Or maybe they'll give you half their secret if you say you'll give them 30 grand.
Is this your own plan for expansion of the business?
No. I'd be giving the game away if I was. So did a whole bunch of research, read a lot of books, made a plan, and for good reason. You can't just jump in without any experience. So I hired someone who had 15 years of experience in the industry. And it was the best thing that I ever did, and I'm glad that I had to, because this employee number one has just done the most amazing job. I mean, If I do everything else and she does everything technical, then we're just the perfect team, even though I don't know how to do everything else. But she knows how to do the technical stuff. We're fine and good to go. So it took us about 9 months to jump through all the hoops to get the thumbs up from the regulator. They eventually said thumbs up, off you go. And that was 9 months ago. So we're still relatively fresh. And let's see, we've got 10 employees, turning over a bit, made break even, got an office dog. And we're looking to open our second office sometime later this year. So happy to answer any questions straight from the coalface.
Okay, so I've got some questions I want to ask, but I want to first off see what the appetite is out there amongst you guys. So who here has got a question to start with? If you can put your hands up to start with so I can get a feel for things. We've one for the moment, we'll see how that goes. So there's a very nice lady called Zoe in the middle here who's going to try and pass you a microphone. If she can't get to you directly, if you wouldn't mind passing it along the line. And just before you ask your question, if you could just possibly say, give us your name and you know something about when you left UCL, that would be of interest to the rest of us.
Of course. My name is Thomas, and I graduated in 2006. I studied engineering, and I've been working as an engineer for the past 5 or 6 years. And my question is related to that. All of you had quite a lot of experience before you actually formed a business that was successful. Do you think that for some of us that haven't had that possibility, maybe doing an MBA would be a fast track as a substitute for maybe 5 or 6 years lost in terms of knowing how to create a business, knowing all of the bits to be a good entrepreneur?
So let me just, if you mind pass the microphone back to Zoe, I'm just going to quickly ask, does anybody on the panel have an MBA? No. Right. So that may well be going some direction to answer your question. Have any of you hired MBAs? Yes. One? No. Have you hired an MBA? No. No? No? One here. Okay, so that's possibly beginning to answer the question. Does anybody have any particular direct answers to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that, Thomas. I haven't done an MBA, as you just worked out, but I've spoken to MBAs at their invitation, and I've also hired MBAs, and my impression is they tend to be very good at their job, the ones that I've hired, and they've been successful inside YouGov, and so I would say it's not a bad idea. By the way, before I had the success, I had a failure, but we only had 5 minutes to talk about our backgrounds, and I think, you know, my advice would be, you've got to try, but be prepared to fail. Mm-hmm. You know, and my failure was catastrophic because, you know, ended up literally, you know, the whole company was brought down, really because I didn't know enough about, you know, the whole business process. I thought it was just about maximizing sales and the front-end marketing. And if I tell you, my failure was when I signed up probably the most famous children's brand that the UK had ever invented. Invented by complete sort of weird coincidence, a lady who now, her office is in my constituency, Ragdoll Productions. You remember Anne Wood? Some of you will know the brand, Teletubbies. I signed the Teletubbies exclusively, other than toys, for the whole of Europe, yet the company ended up going bankrupt. That's because I didn't pay attention to the margin or the bottom line of what it was costing to actually produce the stuff and get it into the retailers, because I didn't understand enough about business. And so, you know, at the time, I thought it was the end of my life. It was a horrible, horrible situation because I'd taken money from friends as investment, and, you know, you have to go and explain to them why this great phenomenon has just lost lots of money when it's meant to be selling millions and millions and millions of pounds of merchandise.
Anybody else particularly?
I'll give you my 5 pieces worth. I would say probably no to the answer. Should you do, to the question rather, should you do an MBA? I think MBAs, and I know an awful lot of people with MBAs, teach you or give you skills that will be very useful in a large organisation. And there is a role for that, and that's where you should direct that effort. But I don't think that's what entrepreneurship or this evening is about. I don't, as far as I'm aware, no one started a large organisation. Entrepreneurship is about an idea, it's about hard work, it's about risk-taking, it's about finding some way of doing something that is different to the way that everybody else is doing it. And I don't think you learn that at business school. So my answer to that question would be no.
A brief question for you rather than the other way around. This is an entrepreneurship networking event. So we've gone with the assumption that you're all at least interested in the topic rather than just the free wine and catering. And obviously Lily's cake, which is outside, although I'm not entirely sure there's enough to go around. Who here is an entrepreneur or an owner-manager running their own business? Who here has got an idea and is working on developing one or is in that way interested in being an entrepreneur? Because that's about half between you. So the rest of you who are here with an interest in entrepreneurship, is this because it's a future possible option for a career, or, okay, there's a few nods and things like that, but you haven't quite yet got the idea? Is that what it's about? Okay. There's a lot of arguments, and it would be inappropriate for me to be sitting here with a UCL job and as an institution that doesn't provide MBAs to tell you what I think of MBAs, but we don't provide MBAs, so let's move on. I want to ask, because we've touched on it in a couple of different ways, when people have talked about the sort of the lows that we've been through as well as some of the highs. I mean, a deliberately quite open-ended question. Perhaps we'll start with Rhys this time and go back this way along the table. But what would be perhaps in a room where you've got people who are starting their own businesses or thinking about doing it and so on? It was one question was about should you do an MBA, but is there anything else that you would impart? What would be your pearl of wisdom, whether it's from your own experiences or an observation that you would pass to people to perhaps say, here's the thing that I wish I'd known before I started?
I think the thing that was most interesting for me to learn was that you don't have to be a genius or a workaholic or just insanely focused on any one thing or brilliant at everything in order to set up a business. You just need some sort of, well, I mean, Lily might disagree, but I think you need a plan. I think you need a vision of where you want to be and a plan to get there. And then you just need the work ethic to get you along there. And I found that one of the hardest bits of the business for me was that we had a period after we started when I realized I knew nothing about marketing, and we had 3 months without a phone call or 2 months without a phone call, and we're starting to sweat and running out of shoe leather and really wondering what in the world was happening. But having had that plan and knowing that, I've done all the research, and to all intents and purposes, there's nothing more I could do. So I must be pushing in the right direction and just hold my nerve. I think that holding your nerve and having a plan are the two key things.
That's very interesting. Okay, Nadine.
I think the one thing that I would impart, or maybe two things. One is be passionate about whatever you do. There's a huge correlation between passion for doing something really well and succeeding at it. When I look at my own experience, and you heard me say it, we didn't start the company to make money. We had no idea what it was going to do. Steve Jobs, I don't think started Apple, or Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg started their businesses to make money. They started because they're passionate about doing something really, really well. So that's number one. And the second one is execution. The world is full of great ideas. I get pitched lots of ideas all the time. The real difference are the people who can deliver on them, which is actually building on Rhys's point, having a plan and being focused and executing on it. That is the difference between success and failure.
Interesting. Okay.
I came across a very interesting quote today, actually. It was somewhere on exactly that point by a fellow called Alan Layton, who some of you may know used to run Asda. And the quote was exactly what Nadeem just said. He said that excellent execution is far more important than a good idea.
He stole it from me.
Yeah.
Martin Scorsese, a highly accomplished film director, which is the example I use along the same lines, always said that a truly great director can make a good film from a bad script, but a great script in the hands of a poor director will never get anywhere. And it's much to do with the execution of it and not just the raw material that you're given. Lily, perhaps your own view on the lesson to impart?
I think, I mean, the original question was what I wish I'd known before I started. I think it kind of, I mean, I wouldn't do an MBA, but there's an enormous amount of, besides the product and the ability and the skill and the passion and the idea, there's an enormous amount of kind of infrastructure to a business which is worth grasping. And I ended up getting a lot of that stuff for me was put in place when I eventually hired somebody who had a lot of experience in running a bakery. But those things are also useful, and you know, if you're going to be an entrepreneur and run your own business, then studying business is, you know, in one way or another, even if you just read about it yourself, it's worth doing.
Thank you. Right, another question from you guys out there. Oh, more hands this time. Let's start with the one just here, if that's all right. Sorry, we'll pass the microphone along. I'm deliberately making this difficult so Zoe's got some people to pass it to, and there's a whole load of people who feel involved by having to pass the microphone along. Right. Sorry, yeah, please. And your name first.
I'm Ali. I graduated from UCL in 2001, Human Sciences, another very useful degree. Lots of people seem to have them. Equip you very well for going into business. I've been working for a year, started an HR consultancy, and I work with a lot of entrepreneurs, owner-managers, people starting their own businesses, and I do psychometric testing. And one of the things that I have, my theory, is that really to start a business successfully, you need to have two things. One is you need to be competitive, dominant, forceful, assertive, whatever word you want to use for it. And the other one is that you need to be quite stubborn and like to do things your own way. Would you guys all say that you are like that? Because I'd be interested in finding out if actually you can start your own business and not be like that.
That's an interesting question and not in any way loaded. Right, let's vary this. I'll start with Nadeem and go that way, and then Lillian goes to Andrew, just to mix it up.
It was competitive, and what was the other thing? Stubborn.
Stubborn.
Forceful, direct, those kinds of words. Yeah, stubborn, that's the one, yeah.
It's interesting because I tell you why it's interesting. I mean, I just reflect on myself. I am competitive. I like to win. I think it's a good thing if I win. But I wouldn't say stubborn. You know, we ran YouGov as a sort of really one. We were two people, very different people, very different backgrounds, and brought different things to the pot. And what's interesting is Stefan's now taken over as CEO and is doing better than I've ever done with the company. I'm very proud of what he's been able to do. But you know, I ran it differently, and I hope also successfully. So we're very different. Yeah, we both were successful in the same job, in that sense. And you know, we always had a sort of open door. You know, our own office was all transparent and glass, and people can just walk in and out. You know, the most junior person can challenge the most senior person on anything. It was that sort of business. It still is that sort of business now that it's in 13 countries, 3 continents, or whatever. He's got, you know, 600 people working for him. So I don't think you have to be what we call in politics conviction politician in terms of stubbornness. And I also think it's interesting because we've just done I sit on a board of a FTSE 250 business in recruitment, and we've just done something for some of the management teams because we're doing succession planning and so on, as public companies have to do. And it's interesting that there's a sort of a gender difference. When I'd love to hear your view on that, is some of the females who are absolutely brilliant, and I'm convinced would make fantastic leaders for the business eventually as CEOs of the business, answer very differently when it comes to, do you have ambition to run the business? You know, a female would say, the first thing they would, let me go the other way. A male would say, yes, I can, of course I can, this is why I can do it. A female would say, well, am I capable of doing it? And they sort of question themselves rather than come forward, you know, with a sort of hard-hitting positivity. And so I think those sort of tests are good, but they are limited in what they can give you. And I think at the end of the day, you know, very different people, become successful.
Reese.
I think it's a bit of a loaded question because is it about those being inherent character traits, or are those about the way people act? Because I think you can, to some extent, control the way that you act. You know, people wearing what would Jesus do bracelets on all the time, trying to act in a way that they think is best. And just because you might not necessarily have always had a competitive streak or necessarily always been focused on being stubborn, I would say that to some extent we have some sort of control over how we behave, how we act. That means that if there's something that we feel we should feel strongly about, or we feel we should be stubborn on, then we can apply that rather than rely on some sort of psychometric traits that we've been reported that we have, rather than traits we've actually chosen. So I'd say, I ask myself when I have a difficult decision to make, or when I have quite a challenge. I ask myself, what would Superman do, or what would Richard Branson do, and that helps me act in a way that I think is better than the way that I might naturally act. So I'm not sure it's entirely important.
As long as the answer isn't get out of a building and fly, spin around the world, spin around the world 3 times and turn time backwards so you can do it all again. That's probably a winning formula. Lily.
I think it definitely depends on what kind of business you want and how you want to grow. But in terms of just being competitive as a rule, like from my own business, it's an industry where people are very competitive. But all my growth has been because of collaborations and really like sharing opportunities and encouraging other businesses like mine to grow, forming networks. So I wouldn't advocate competitiveness as a business strategy. And then in terms of being stubborn, I think you have to trust your initiative and your own creativity and your ideas, and you have to believe that you have strength in that. Otherwise you would never begin. But then I think at the stage I'm at now, 2 years down the line, it's really important not to be too stubborn, to embrace other people, so you're going to eventually have to hire people, possibly. And your business will have to grow beyond yourself. And if you are too locked into believing that your way is the only way of doing things, then you won't be able to grow.
And Andrew.
I agree with everybody on the panel. I am in awe of the common sense that is being spoken of today. I don't really know what to add. I would say the answer to the question is yes to competition. I think it's a vital part of the nature of doing business, full stop. I think we live in a highly competitive world. I think the current climate, if anybody's thinking of starting or doing something now, is getting harder and harder. Stubbornness is a necessary quality. I think there are other great qualities that you need to look at when you start a business or you're thinking of starting a business. One of them being optimism. I think you have to be optimistic. We have an awful lot of people. We like to describe our business as being in the people business. We're more in the people business than we are in the food business, because there's probably not a single person in this room that hasn't been to a restaurant or hasn't got a favourite restaurant. And if you sit and you think about what it is that takes you back to that restaurant, it's rarely just the food. It's the environment, it's the service, it's there's many, it's the price point. There's many different, it's a very, very complicated business, but it's certainly not just about the food. And we, certainly in our business, we take a huge, I would say only in the last few years, we've really understood, because we had no idea before, the importance of HR, the importance of treating people well, of recruiting the right people. We are constantly churning, for want of a better word, to try and get better people in the business. That doesn't have to be an aggressive process. It's just trying to upgrade the people, because if you get better people around you, you will have an easier life. It's as simple as that. So, on occasion, as Ruth says, you need to be stubborn, and you need to figure out what Superman would say, and very nicely put. And on other occasions, you've got to listen to people, and you've got to let them do things. Because if you find yourselves in an organisation where people are being employed and you dictate, then you will not get the sort of people that I suspect you want. So it's a balance, and many things in business are finding that balance between when to push and when to listen.
And if you don't mind me abusing my chair's position for a moment and giving an answer from my own experience of before I arrived here, making and losing a million or two of my own, unfortunately in the wrong order. It's much easier, I made mine and lost it, as opposed to Nadeem, who lost some and then made it, which I can tell you is a vastly preferable way of doing it. You should really learn from that experience. If you don't learn from anything else, it makes the highs higher and the lows less painful. But stubborn, absolutely. That's every single person on this panel has just given you an example of where they basically said, it was all going wrong, and I went on anyway. So yes, you have to be that. You do to some degree have to be forceful, because by definition you're advocating an idea that hasn't been done before, to some degree, or at least where you're doing it. So I think that's self-evident. Direct, I think there's a pretty good example of everybody on the panel being direct. And I think perhaps the most interesting one is competitive. Because I think you do have to be competitive, and in a weird sense, and excuse me if this sounds incredibly old-fashioned, but in an almost archetypal English sense of competitiveness, which is you go out there and you compete hard, and whether you win or lose, you go to the pub afterwards. Because frankly, you hire the people who are better than you at your job. And we've talked about that. We talked about an example of getting somebody who really understood the technical parts of the business, a different part of business brain. Nadeem talking about Stefan who's come to the business afterwards. Reece talking about somebody else who's there. If you can't see that as actually being to your benefit and being a good thing, and you're so competitive that you resent that, yeah, then give up, because frankly, you're just going to bring your own endeavours and work down from the outset. So you can't be a bad loser, and it's not at all cost. There's a colleague of ours from Stanford who is in many ways way too Californian, and likes to hug everything and go, gee, it's great, to even things that clearly aren't. But she makes the point that entrepreneurship is a team sport. And if anything, it's a contact sport. And it's kind of true. It seems like a solo effort, but there really is a lot of that in there. And if you can't compete with people in the team, you won't succeed. Anyway, there you go. I'm just throwing that out there. You can tell me I'm wrong if you want. Right, a couple more questions, please. So, we're adding, every time I ask this, there's more people. Actually, Zoe, the lady next to you actually had a question first. Come on.
Hi, I'm Melanie. I did a Masters in English back in 2003. I now work in the publishing industry. I had a couple of questions. The first one was, what was the biggest obstacle that you each came across when you were setting up your business? And secondly, how important do you think branding is? And how did you come up with your brands?
Okay, so there were two questions there, and I'm going to actually try and speed up the responses from the panel, because we're into that sort of not necessarily the winding up bit, but we're approaching the final fences. In order to give everybody a start going first, I'm going to turn to Lily first with the biggest obstacle, and how did you develop your brand? Biggest obstacle?
Biggest obstacle was when my first stockist was Harrods. Before that, I'd been very bespoke, private orders, big jobs, but went straight into Harrods. Felt like the time was the right time, and they approached me. So I said yes.
And quite clearly, it's not a bad place to start. That's clearly the other side of that.
Well, it looks great, but it turns out that their business is very different from mine. They're very bureaucratic. There's a lot of red tape. My approach is very homegrown, and my product's very handmade. And so I think. What I learned from that, that was an obstacle, because we were unable to communicate successfully at first, and they weren't happy with what I was delivering, and I wasn't happy with what they were asking of me, which was to change my products. And so I think that was my first obstacle, just as a point of experience.
Let's perhaps just take the first obstacles first, because then it sort of makes sense to have the four of those and then come back into the branding one. Me changing things on you slightly, because I think that makes more sense. So, biggest obstacle, Andrew?
I think it's quite a difficult question. I think probably in our sort of business, it's raising money. We're in the leisure business, we're in the hospitality business, but we're effectively in the retail business as well. When you start taking premises and you start employing people, which you obviously have to do, and you've got no history, then getting money to get a lease, get the sort of hardware of the business behind you is very challenging as a startup. We were very lucky, so it wasn't much of an obstacle for us. We did it through basically friends and family, and we had a bit of a track record, and we managed to do it. But I would imagine in the sort of sector that I'm in, it's an enormous challenge for someone who wants to start I was just saying to Lily earlier, the way that she's doing a business, which is literally growing from an idea and starting it and making a little bit of money and then saving a bit of money and reinvesting the business. It's the most exciting way of doing a business.
Mm-hmm.
Going out and raising money, I've got £1 million in the bank and I'm going to go and take a big shop somewhere and study. Apart from being enormously stressful, it's a lot less fun. And you end up giving away a lot more of the business as well, of course, because no one's going to give you money for free. Yeah, that's the sort of obstacle that we came across.
Okay, thank you very much. Reese.
Regulation, because it's a highly regulated industry. But then on the other hand, me being regulated means that you can't start up next to me for at least a year. So it's my advantage now, but it was the biggest hurdle that I came across.
So you could give away that secret you talked about earlier and be completely safe for at least 6 months.
For a year.
Oh, okay. And Nadine, biggest...
Yeah, it was really to convince the world that this data was meaningful and worth paying for. That was the hardest thing. Once that happened, once you believed the data and the accuracy, it's faster, it's deeper, it's cheaper, everything else falls into place. But to survive long enough to be able to convince the world was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, because I can't tell you what it's like going into an office where you start literally sort of getting the visions of these sort of pound signs just sort of evaporating in front of you because you're hemorrhaging and there's no money coming in.
Okay, and so to overcome some of those problems, hopefully, because this is where it could go terribly wrong, all the panel believe they developed successful brands to help go some of those problems. So going through the same order again, Lily, has the brand been part of the solution to that, or not yet?
It wasn't that it was the solution. I mean, I think my brand, my branding was very strong, and that's been, I think, the name of my business and the way it's positioned as a brand has been one of the most important things, and that's something that's reliable, that's always there. But I mean, in my instance, it happened. I mean, it evolved very naturally. Again, it was like the name was like a joke, and then I just kind of used it because it was funny. And then and then I had an idea in mind for the logo, and it worked well. And but I think it's been enormously important. I mean, it's done me well.
And Andrew, perhaps the most obvious example of a brand-led business here in many ways.
We are a brand-led business, and brands are good, but they're not only good. I mean, our view of the brand is that a brand promises certain things to the customer. You see, in our case, I don't know how many of you have been to a giraffe, but
how many people have been to Giraffe?
You're all,
there you go.
You're a very good crowd. But I don't know what you will think about giraffes, but you will probably have one of the things that we've struggled with enormously, and we still struggle with, is actually defining what our brand is. It's not an Italian operation, it's not a Chinese operation, it's not a clearly defined thing, and that in one sense is a great asset, but it's also been a liability, and it's something we manage ongoingly. So the great benefits of being a brand are that we do promise things.
Can I just ask about that? So, how did that develop? Did that develop as a conscious response to the fact that there were Italian chains and there was a French chain and there was something else chain, and you were looking for a different angle, or was it that you were imagining what it would be like and it kind of evolved? How did that come around?
The original idea, we started on a beach, and we were listening to some music. Putumayo music, I don't know if any of you know the record labels, world music, it's happy music, there's no crashing and burning music. And we wanted to create this happy place and bring it into the restaurants where people could come and have their meal. The idea was global food. So the clincher was that at the time that we opened, first of all, there was no such thing really as all-day dining in London. You would go for lunch, or you would go for dinner, or you'd go for breakfast or lunch, and we were open all day long. And the second thing was that we looked at a group of 4 people and we said, okay, the first person that decides where you're going out tonight will say, let's go for Chinese. And maybe one of the other 4 wants to eat Chinese as well, but the other 2 don't. But the groups decided we're going for Chinese, so I'll find something to eat. And so our confusing message, it confused ourselves for a while, was that we will try and do, as authentically as possible, food and dishes from around the world. So we didn't do what was sometimes known as fusion, where we took an Italian dish and put a Moroccan sauce on top and, you know, really just mashed it up. We took a proper Moroccan dish or a Japanese dish or a traditional English breakfast, or latterly we've been doing an awful lot of burgers. And we did them the very best we could. And that's exactly what we still do now. And so if you're going to have a Thai curry in one of our restaurants, hopefully it's as good as we can deliver in that style. So the idea being that anybody can walk into our restaurants at any time of the day. You can have a coffee and a croissant, you can have a 3-course meal, and we have, the thing that I find very exciting is we have different people that use our space for completely different activities. We have the customer that comes in every day for a coffee and a croissant, and we have people that come in, believe it or not, I find it surprising, but it's true, that Dean Giraffe is the right place to propose to their spouse. Right? And we have the full breadth.
Sorry, is there any lady here who would say yes if their guide said it's a giraffe, or is there anybody who has done that?
If I'm honest, okay. It hasn't happened for a while. But I mean, you know, people use us in very different ways, and I love that. I want as many people in the business as possible. I want the greatest flexibility. I want people to enjoy it, and this is all part of the brand. When you come to branding, though, it's difficult to define that, and that's certainly something that we continue to struggle with.
So I love the fact, I love the idealism that this panel is showing this evening. So we have the model for a happy place where proposals happen and all sorts of family events. We've had the story of cakes being put together for sort of wacky all-day Sunday parties in a warehouse off Brick Lane, served with margaritas and just because cakes are nice. We've got the idea of YouGov being started with the ideal of democratising all this data and hopefully telling all those nasty people in Westminster what the people really think, which obviously is now Nadine. And we have the idea that all the old people's homes, as they were commonly thought of, are not factories but places that really care about people and are the passion for taking care of people. That's actually quite a nice unifying theme along here, and actually probably is not just an accident of the panelists that we've got, but I think in my experience is a difference between successful entrepreneurs and less successful entrepreneurs. They're the ones who've got an ideal and a vision about what they want to change. But Nadine, was it backed up by a brand? Does the YouGov brand matter in the same way as it perhaps does in other industries?
I think it does. It matters hugely. As someone who started off as an engineer and ended up as a marketeer, I can say to you, I mean, Andrew, you've got a great brand because it's memorable. It's number one. That's a big barrier, and it's got sort of positive halo around it. So that's fantastic. And Lily, I love the Lily Vanilli. I mean, I remember Milli Vanilli when that's how old I am. When they first came out and then had a problem. But it's still fantastic. YouGov was my invention because it was really back to where we believed that the consumer democracy, that the consumer will become much more powerful when the internet becomes ubiquitous. And we've seen that now. I mean, if you look at what's happening in the Middle East, without politicizing the meeting, but you think of what happened in Tunisia and Egypt and Facebook and Twitter, and I've recently visited with a bunch of parliamentarians Syria, and I met with a bunch of young people in the British Council who are all learning to speak English. And you ask them whether, I said, show of hands, who's got a Facebook page? They all put their hand up when it's banned in their country. And I said, well, how does that work? He said, we just go through proxy servers. And that's the exciting thing about the world. That's where, YouGov's sort of original idea was you connect up the whole world, you actually structure opinion so that it can't be hijacked, it can't be gamed by particular campaign groups or people, fringe parties or anything else. Surely to God, that's a better way of governing ourselves, or creating brands, or creating consumer brands, whether it's supermarkets or restaurants or anything else. If they understand better, you heard Andrew saying, they need to understand better the consumer, then they'll serve the consumer better, if they're smart, and they are smart. So what's in a brand? For me, I would say to you, which is why I made the sort of initial comments about Giraffe and Lily Vanilli, I think it's got to be memorable. The thing about YouGov is you could type it in the computer. It's it's straightforward, and you could remember it, and it was different to everything else that was around at the time.
And so finally, Reece, you've got a brand that's dominated, or a market that's dominated by regulation. So is a brand as important in that, or is it less so because of the way the market works?
I think it's entirely important. I mean, if you're not competing on price, then you don't ever want to be competing on price. You're competing on quality. And in order for people to be able to identify your quality, it's all about how you present yourself. It's your identity, and you want it to be as complete and as consistent as it possibly can. I don't mean spending millions on branding at the start, but getting an idea of who you are and how you're different is vitally important. And what our brand is all about is keeping people independent in their own home and treating them as adults rather than as babies. And so having looked for months at websites covered in pictures of old people being hugged by young people until my eyes bled, I said, there's no way that I ever want anything to do with this. And suddenly I'm the only one in the industry that hasn't got pictures of young people hugging old people, which actually in itself separates us without the whole quality brand promise that we're going for. So I think branding tells everyone who you are, how you position yourself. It's vital if you want to be someone who isn't everyone else.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take a final grouping of questions and perhaps pick up more than one. This is the first hand to go up here, so we'll take 1 and 2 here, and then see what those look like, and if there's enough time, we'll come back to the third one here. Sorry, please.
So I had an...
Your name first, sorry.
Oh, sorry, Sarah. I graduated from History of Art in 2006.
That's almost a proper subject.
Indeed. So clearly I have absolutely no idea how businesses work. And a year ago I had an idea that I'm really passionate about. But the thing is that obviously I don't have much business knowledge, and every time I start to do market research or develop my product, I find out new sort of ways of analysing markets and competitive positioning that I didn't know before. And my question really is, how do you, when you don't have a business background, sort of shortcut that and, develop yourself in your business mind? And also, how do you know when to take the plunge? Because you could always make your business plan and your own business knowledge better before you start.
Okay, I'm going to come back and summarise those in a second. There was a question here, Zoe, second row back.
Hi, my name is Alex. I graduated in 2008, and I'm currently a trainee solicitor. My question is, what advice have you got in relation to dealing with competition from, established players in the market? So if you've got your niche area, you've got a good idea, other established players might be able to notice this opportunity and they can quickly move in with their resources. So how can you make sure that you've got something competitive, something special to offer?
Okay, and unless anybody else, there was a third one here, and actually what I'm going to do is not ask all the questions to all the panellists, so please go on.
Okay, cool. Dan, Anthropology 2005, currently work in marketing. I'm really interested in, this maybe a slightly strange question, but how it makes you feel to actually be running your own business now. I think that's one of the things that really, what I get excited about, actually being my own boss, my own destiny, and all that kind of stuff. But I'm really interested in how it makes you feel.
Okay, so we've got 3 questions there, which perhaps we won't necessarily, unless anybody's trying to say anything, ask all of the panellists. But we'll summarise slightly. So the first one from Sarah is, how do you sort of effectively shortcut formal business training? If you think you've got a good idea, how do you quickly get on to the ideas, how do you analyse markets and things like that, and the things that you need to do to get business going? Do I have a rapid volunteer who wants to move forward to that one? Or I'm kind of thinking that actually...
I think we can take all 3 and just try and...
All right, okay, you want to do those? Okay, well, it sounds like that was a volunteer to go first. So the first one is, how do you shortcut your business training if you have none? And we'll do them one at a time, but very quickly.
Thanks. Just very quickly, I think your question was about when do you take the plunge? I think you just take it. You don't wait. You don't try and sort of keep digging further. You just take the plunge. Do you want to keep going? Or
no, do that one. That's fine.
Right,
Reece?
Yeah, I'd say take the plunge. You could wait years till you get it just right, but then the market's moved on. Get your plan, make sure you have a fair idea, get someone to look at it, and then just get on with it.
Yep. Lily?
Yeah, I mean, take the plunge when you're ready, and well, I mean, do it now. But if you're gonna spend time on anything, spend that time developing your product, making it the best that it can be, so that by the time you do offer it to the market, you're offering them something good. I think that's really important.
Andrew?
I've got some very gung-ho panellists here today. Of course they're right, but the risks are higher, is what I would say in answer to that. If you want to take a slightly more cautious approach, then I would suggest you find people and get them around you who are far more experienced than you, with whom you can share your idea, and bounce ideas off and discuss it with them. And I think, you know, doing anything in today's market is very hard. I would suggest that find some people. And it's not just to start a business, it's when you're running a business, and it's when you're running a business of £1,000 turnover, and it's when you're running a business of £1 million turnover, and it's running a business when you're £100 million turnover. There's somebody who knows more than you, who's been there, done it, and can offer some sort of angle that you haven't yet seen. And whether it's mentoring, whether it's family and friends, whether it's anybody, I'm a great believer, as it was mentioned earlier, that nobody does anything on their own. And you know, running a business, or sort of my experience of running a business, is that you go through moments of elation and you go through moments of real heartache. And like a marriage, in a sense, I'm not suggesting all marriages are like that, but like a marriage, you need to have the support of somebody else, right? And it can be a life partner, it can be a business partner, it can be any other person, but you need to have someone who can give you that support when, we've heard the stories, when times are tough and when you just don't know the answers.
And I'd just say, has anybody here ever eaten in Toast? Or any of the kind of salad bar chains that exist there? There are a few of those. A friend of mine came up with the idea of doing that about 8 years ago. He spent 5 years writing the business plan, walked down Tottenham Court Road, went one day and basically went, oh, bugger. And somebody had done there first. At some point you just have to start. It won't be right. It never is. It's going to change. Get on with it. Right, very second, Alex's question. Very quickly, and again, I'm going to start with Dean because you actually referred to this earlier, dealing with competition from established players. How do you basically nail them?
I mean, ours was a particularly competitive landscape. You had some giants in the industry. I mean, giants as in multi-billion pound or dollar businesses, Nielsen, Mori, Ipsos, you know, all these great big names. And the way we went for it is, one, to always attack them. I don't know whether there's a great book called Eating the Big Fish, worth reading if you get a chance, because you have advantages as a challenger brand, and they are you're quicker, you can make decisions quicker, you're more nimble. Obviously, the disadvantage is the obvious one, is that you are microscopic, and they can just brush you away. But then try and focus on one particular bit of the industry that you think you can do better. We happen to fall upon, partly because we're passionate about political research, and it's a shop window because it's the one that's the most public, that the media are interested in. And so try and work out, what is going to get you, to cut through the noise. And the political research and the academic research is what did it for us. And I would say the third element, which is actually luck. And if any businessman who's successful tells you they had no luck, they did it all by planning, they are either lying or they are naive and not telling the truth. The luck bit is two-tiered. One, the dot-com bubble burst, so the giants stopped investing in digital platforms. And the second bit of luck is most of them set themselves up against us. So Bob Worcester, the great Bob Worcester of Mori, Ipsos Mori, in his book said the two guys from YouGov, the two boys, as he called us, made a valiant effort for the general election of 2001, but I guarantee you that internet research is voodoo and will be proved eventually to not work, and the internet will never be used for market research. That was a wonderful break for us, because it allowed us the oxygen that we needed to be able to get large enough so they can't take us out.
Okay, and going down this side then, and back to Reece at the end. So, dealing with competition from established players, a sort of quick guide?
Quick guide would be just to put, I mean, it depends if your business is product-based, but to put your personality into it. and develop your product so that it's unique, and if it's good enough, then there won't be competition. That's what happened in my experience. I mean, the market was pretty much arguably saturated, but my product was substantially different and good enough so that I have an enormous amount of opportunity in office.
I should just assure you that wasn't your answer that made Nadine leave. He always had to leave at past, and we'll only be a couple more minutes. Sorry, Andrew, taking on the competition.
I think you just need to get on with it. I mean, our business we are constantly afraid of people starting up. I don't know which way you're turning it. Are we afraid of bigger businesses or smaller businesses?
Yeah. Either way.
We're afraid of both. Because you're entering a competitive market by definition, unless you are a 1 in a million business that really creates something that doesn't exist. And if you manage to do that, which is fantastic, it won't be long before somebody's doing it behind you, right? Unless it's an outstandingly brilliant idea. So I think you just have to get on with it. And we're constantly afraid of startups. I think the startup end of the market is where all the creativity is. I don't believe large companies or larger companies are anywhere near as creative or dynamic as smaller businesses, and I think that applies to just about any market, except for ones where massive amounts of finance are needed. So trust me, if you're thinking of starting a business, I suspect the incumbents are more afraid of you than you need to be afraid of them.
Okay. And Rhys?
Yeah, I have to agree. There's totally sensible answers. I mean, the thing is, although I said earlier you don't have to be a genius, but I'm sure that any one of you who goes into business will have a higher IQ than the average of the competition. So you've got that advantage. You're quicker, and also the competition goes home at 5:30, and you don't, and you'll just keep going until you die. Whereas they'll go home. At 5:30 and say, well, you know, what the hell? It's not my problem. So yeah, you're more into it than anyone you're up against.
Some of us are here still working at 8:30, I'd like to point out. But so very, very final question then from us. Though I'm going to twist it slightly. There was Dan's question about how does it make you feel to be running your own business, and I'm going to ask you if you can basically summarize that in 3 words. What would be the 3 words you would pick to explain how it makes you feel to be running your own business? And we'll reverse order it from the way we started. So Rhys, your 3 words.
What a rush.
Ooh, so smooth. Okay, Lily?
I'm excited, inspired, and encouraged.
Ooh, excited, inspired, and encouraged. Very good. And finally, Andrew.
Great words. I guess at the stage we're at now, we've grown. So I would describe running our business now as probably freedom with responsibility.
Oh. See, it's very good. He's had such an erudite panel to finish some things this evening. Just a couple of final words to wrap things up with this evening before we allow you to move on outside again. Hopefully this will now work. Well, hello, stop, go back, stay. Is it going to stay? Yes, wonderful. Right, which is just to finish with a few things. Which I said at the beginning that I talked a little bit about what Advances does and things like that. If you have been inspired by the panel this evening, or either because you're running your own business and you'd like to come back and help give something back, or because you're starting your business right now and you'd like some help, these are 3 of the people that I'd like to introduce you to, or rather there are on here 3 people I'd like to briefly introduce you to, that you'll be able to meet in the networking session that follows to be able to do something for that. And I'm going to ask them each to stand up while I explain who they are. So Paul, if you wouldn't mind standing up. Paul here represents, I'd say hello, Paul. Hello. There you go. Paul here is representing our Hello project. That's not a typo. Hello stands for Higher Education London Outreach. It's to do with my penchant for silly names, for projects. And Hello is a project which basically means if you're starting a small business or you're running a small business and you think that a small sort of consultancy-style project staffed by members of UCL's academic community or their students, things like that, would be able to help you do something like, to use your example, a marketing study or, or doing a prototype or something like that. This is a project where basically we find people who want to do that for you. We don't charge you anything, and provided there are bits of student and staff that would find it interesting to carry out that kind of project, we offer that to you as a way of engaging you and a way of supporting your business. The next one up here is Smile. which is represented by Ruth. Say hello, Ruth. She's smiling as well. That's marketing for you. And SMILE stands for Selected Mentors and Interim Managers for London Enterprises. And that's basically one where we take people who are starting small businesses and we match them to mentors, whether they be from within the UCL community or not, but to help them, give them that kind of advice and encouragement to get them going. There was to be a third project called Lucky, whereby the slogan was going to be say hello, smile and get lucky. Unfortunately, we haven't so far, so I've yet to find the funding for that. So the third part of this program at the moment is represented by Laura. So Laura, if you wouldn't mind standing up. And Laura's very cheerful. Laura runs our training programs, which are aimed at entrepreneurs and owner-managers of small businesses, where basically what we're trying to do is take somebody who says, I'm quite good at doing something, baking cakes, doing PR, running an HR consultancy, but I actually don't know anything about running a business. You don't need an MBA. You don't need to be overly trained. What you need to know is, how do I actually market something when I don't actually have a business and I don't have any money? What are the basics of finance I need to know as an entrepreneur to be able to talk to the people I will hire who will actually do this for me, like accountants and so on. So Laura manages those programs, and the three of them will be gathered around the Advances stands immediately on the outside as you go out. Those are people here who, if you're interested, it's about the kind of things we do to try and help you guys. So that's enough of the advertising from me. I would like to say thank you very much for all of you for coming. You can applaud yourselves now. And I would also like very much if you could put your hands together for Andrew, Lily, Nadeem and Reese.